All right, guys, we are going to continue with Unit 3, which is on culture. And today we are going to cover language, which is Chapter 7. So remember that Unit 3 includes Chapter 6, 7, and 8. So this is the PowerPoint for Chapter 7, language. Language is a huge part of culture, so I want you guys to just go over this quote with me real quick. It says, in 1979, schools on the Navajo Reservation had about 80% of students speaking Navajo. 10 years later, only 5%. There's just too much English influence to really be effective in keeping our language. If the Navajo language is lost, we will not be a unique people. We will have no culture. We will have no prayers. So to many people, really language is their culture. It's the most important part of it. And what we see around the world is really a huge language extinction going on. Thousands and thousands of languages have already gone extinct, and we are seeing more and more and more every day. So take a second and watch this video about language extinction. Right now, there's somewhere around 7,000 languages that are spoken around the world. However, most of those are very small, isolated groups. By the end of the century, about half of those will all be gone. As these groups integrate into larger societies, people often learn the language of the majority, and their traditional language becomes extinct. For example, there are lots of indigenous tribes in South America, in places like Peru. However, many of those indigenous languages are going extinct because the people of those tribes are choosing to learn and speak Spanish, which is the majority language in Peru. So that's how these languages are going extinct. The people aren't dying out. The languages are dying out because of the influence of these larger, more powerful languages. So as languages become extinct, a central part of the group's history and identity is lost. And that's why this is such a travesty for many of these small, isolated cultures. As we said, language is essential to a group's culture as it creates a sense of place, this belonging, and it's also part of the cultural landscape. We can see our language all around us in written form on the cultural landscape, whether it's street signs or various advertisements. All of that is part of our language cultural landscape. So current communication technologies are reshaping cultures and bringing drastic change to age-old practices and languages. Language, like all elements of culture, has long been changing, and language constantly evolves. It's always changing. The earliest languages have spread from their hearths and faced many local, international, and global forces, including conquest, colonialism, imperialism, and trade. And all of these things have an effect on changing and evolving the language. A linguist is a scientist who studies languages. This belief that humans first began communicating with spoken sound as recently as tens of thousands of years ago, or as long as a few 100,000 years ago. But most linguists believe that the first language and the first people were in sub-Saharan Africa. So we do believe that sub-Saharan Africa is where that first, what linguists call the mother tongue, the very first language that humans spoke was. And if you really think about it, language is such an interesting concept because really all language is sounds that we've all agreed mean something. Right now, I'm just making sounds with my mouth, but we've agreed that those sounds have this certain meaning, and that's all language is around the world. So unsure how the language diffused, the dispersion of people which carried that language with them as they dispersed across the planet, also transmission, people learned language from their neighbors, and conquest, this imposing language on others, is how we get the current distribution of language around the world. So while some linguists believe that all language did have this origination, this mother tongue, what we can actually group is only about 15 what are called language families, which means we know that these languages were at one point connected through a common ancestor. So if you have languages that are part of the same language family, it means at one time it was one single language. But what happened is the people moved around, they became isolated from one another, and the language changed and became the various different languages, but they shared that common origin. A language tree shows the relationship among these language families and suggests how several languages are related to each other and how one language grows out of another. So the distribution of languages really reflects human migration. That's how new languages come about. As a group splits off, they become isolated, they encounter new things, they have to make up new words for it. All of those things then over time change the language so much it becomes a new language. Take a second and watch this awesome TED Ed video that explains this concept of how we get all of these new languages. So here's an example of, or a few examples of language trees. Language trees are representation of language families. So all of the languages that you see on the leaves that are attached to the same trunk are all part of the same language family. So we see here on the far right, the largest being the Indo-European family. That means all of these languages at one time were one single language, and then as those migrated out, the language changed into all of these various languages that we have today. Over here on the left, we have what is known as the Sino-Tibetan language family, and you can see there's actually far fewer languages that are part of it, but actually the most spoken language in the world is part of the Sino-Tibetan language family, which is Mandarin Chinese. Right? So this is just a visual representation of understanding language families. So we have the family, which is the trunk of the tree. Then you have branches. As you can see on the Indo-Iranian here on the right, the Indo-European, we have several different branches. We have the Indo-Iranian here, and as you can see, large languages include languages like Bengali and Hindi. We have the Romance language, which includes languages like Spanish and Portuguese and French. Then we have the Germanic branch, which includes languages like English and German. That's because those that are part of the same branch have an even more recent ancestor. Now, we don't know exactly who the Indo-European speakers were because it was so long ago. However, in many cases for the branches, we do know exactly who those people were because it wasn't that long ago. For example, the Romance branch language, those are all connected because at one time all of those languages were Latin, which is why it's known as the Romance branch because of the Romans who spoke Latin. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, those places became separated and the language changed and turned into Spanish, Portuguese, French, and so forth. So here again is the Indo-European language family a little bit more up close. And so we can see that all of these languages here on the Indo-European family were at one point connected. But through time, through migration, we end up with all of the various languages that we have today. And yes, that does mean that Hindi and English have a common ancestor. However, it was very, very long ago, and so Hindi and English are not going to have very much in common. Whereas English and German are going to have a lot more in common because they're part of that same branch, which means they have a much more recent ancestor. And we do know, again, exactly who those people were. They were the Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons. So the main language family that you need to know for the AP exam is the Indo-European language family. And that's because it is the largest language family, even though the most spoken language in the world is not part of it. The way that that's true is because Indo-European just has a lot of languages. So if you add up Spanish and English and Russian and all of these languages, there's more speakers of all of those languages than compared to just Mandarin. But if we're looking at individual languages, Mandarin Chinese is the most spoken first language in the world. So Indo-European is one of the 15 major language families. Nearly half of the world's population speaks one of the languages of the Indo-European family. About 2.8 billion native speakers of between 400 and 500 different languages. So the main different branches of the Indo-European family are Germanic, which is what the English language is part of, the Balto-Slavic, which are the Eastern European languages like Russian and Polish. We have the Celtic, which are the original languages of the British Isles. We also have the Romance branch, which is French and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian. We also have the Indo-Iranian, which are the languages found in South Asia, like Hindi and Urdu and Bengali. So as we were saying, we don't know exactly who the original speakers of Indo-European were, but we do know about the branches. We said the Romance branch languages started with Latin, and the history of Latin shows how difficult the study of language is. Languages constantly evolve as people move away from the language's cultural hearts because of contact with other languages or isolation from other languages. So 2,000 years ago, when the Roman Empire dominated what is now Europe, people throughout the empire spoke Latin. However, as the Roman Empire dissolved and transportation became more dangerous, trade declined, and these Latin speakers became geographically isolated from each other, the language evolved differently in different places. In the area that is today France, Latin became French. In the area that is today Italy, Latin became Italian. In the area that is today Spain, it becomes Spanish. In the area that is today Portugal, it becomes Portuguese. In the area that's today Romania, it becomes Romanian because of the isolation that occurred after the fall of the Roman Empire. So this led to these distinct regional languages that, again, we grouped together today to call the Romance languages. And many of them have a lot in common. Portuguese and Spanish have a ton in common because they are right next to each other, and so they had more contact with one another. So here's a chart of Latin words compared to those same words in these various other languages. And you can see this is called a sound shift, where it starts out as one and then over time the word becomes something different, but you can tell that originally they were the same word. So you can see that with all of these various words like father, mother, bread, wolf, and day. Take a second and watch this other really great TED Ed video about the origins of the English language. Languages can also be divided into smaller categories within the same language. These are known as accents and dialects. So an accent often reflects social class or a geographic region, and the geographic boundary of a certain linguistic feature is known as an isogloss. So an isogloss is like the border between different terms. So here on this map, we can see an isogloss between the southern accent word of y'all versus the northern and western of you guys. Variations in accent, grammar, usage, and spelling create dialects or regional variations of a language. These are different enough to tell the difference, but similar enough that they are still understood as the same language. Hello everybody versus hi y'all and hi yous guys. Everybody knows what these things mean, but we use different terms depending on what region you're in. So adages are sayings that attempt to express a truth about life. Like the pen is mightier than the sword. That would be an example. So within the English language, there's a lot of different variations. Here in the US, we speak what is known as American English. In England, they speak British English. In Australia, they speak Australian English. And there are differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, spelling, and cadence between all of these different dialects. And then we have different dialects even within dialects. We said here in America, we have, Southern, and we have New England. We have all of these different accents within the American English dialect. But here we just have some differences in this chart between American and British English. So take a second and watch this video about some of this difference. Language is often spread through diffusion, the spread of culture over wide areas. The reason why we are speaking English right now, which started on a small island across an ocean, is because of the diffusion through the British Empire. We were a British colony. That's the reason why we're speaking English today. So major globalized languages include English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and so forth. Now, the most globalized are going to be those European languages, and that is strictly due to colonization. So these languages spread from their hearths largely because of conquest and colonization. Arabic is a very major world language because of religion. So Arabic is the standard religious language of Islam, which is the second largest religion in the world. And so many Muslims, even if Arabic is not their main language, they learn to at least read in it. Many of them also learn to speak it because of the holy book of the Quran. So we said that many of the European languages have diffused because of colonization. However, some languages have never diffused widely. We said Mandarin Chinese is the most commonly spoken first language in the entire world. However, it's really only found in China. And the reason why it's the most spoken language is because there's a ton of people in China who are speaking Mandarin Chinese. Now, it has migrated to a few places like Singapore and Taiwan, but that's because the Chinese people moved to those places. But China never established that many colonies outside of Asia like the Europeans did. So Chinese speakers have always been concentrated in and around China. While Mandarin Chinese is the most spoken first language in the world, English is actually the most widely used language in the world, but it's because it's so many people's second language as well. So nearly 1.5 billion people around the world know how to speak English. Mostly concentrated in lands colonized by Great Britain, the United States, Canada, South Africa, India, and Australia. So as we said, Mandarin Chinese is the most spoken first language, but English is the most spoken second language in the world, which tells us that many English speakers actually speak a different primary or native language, and they use English to communicate with other people who speak different languages. That makes English what is known as a lingua franca. This is an important vocab term that means a common language used by people who do not share the same native language. For example, in the West African country of Nigeria, there are over 500 different native languages spoken in Nigeria. So if I'm from one tribe and you're from a different tribe and we have different tribal languages, we are going to speak English to speak to each other because most Nigerians also learn how to speak English, even though it's not their first language. They use it to communicate with all of the various different tribal languages that are spoken in Nigeria. So the term lingua franca literally means Frankish tongue, and the term is actually a mixture of this language that was originally spoken in the Levant, which you can see from the map is this area of the Middle East where all of these different languages kind of came together originally. So today, English is one of the biggest lingua francas in the world, and a lot is because of globalization and technology. Historically, English was a lingua franca, a second language that people used for communication because of the dominance of the British Empire. Today, a lot of people learn English as a lingua franca because of globalization and technology being diffused from the US. For example, many people in China and Japan learn English to get ahead in business, but also for pop culture reasons, so that they can watch American movies without subtitles and American music and so forth. So again, historically, English is a lingua franca because of the British, but today it's really because of US dominance in terms of globalization. So again, we said that historically it was because of the British, but today globalization and technology has a lot more to do with the US dominance. So multinational corporations based in the US, some in Great Britain, made English the common language for international business around the world. Scientists and other scholars, airline pilots throughout the world, and many journalists began to use English to communicate across the globe. So English evolved as a lingua franca of the internet because the internet began here in the US and is widely used in social media. Television shows and movies are often in English and they are shown around the world. Now, some critics feel resentment over this because they feel that their language and culture is starting to be diluted because of the dominance of the American language and culture. And in fact, some countries have actually put laws in place to try to restrict this dominance. For example, in France, radio stations have to play a certain amount of French music every hour. They cannot just play American music all day, every day. We said English is the dominant lingua franca for business around the world, but it's definitely not the only lingua franca in the world. Arabic is a lingua franca throughout North Africa and the Middle East and also parts of Southeast Asia. Spanish is a huge lingua franca throughout Latin America, where there's lots of different tribal languages, but many people know how to speak Spanish as well. French would be in parts of Central Africa. Swahili would be in parts of East Africa, and Russian would be in many parts of Central Asia that used to be part of the Soviet Union. So a lot of times students get confused between lingua francas and pidgin and creoles. So you got to understand there is a difference between all of these terms. A lingua franca is a second language, and that second language you use to communicate. A pidgin is when speakers of two different languages who have extensive contact with each other, often because of trade, they don't know a separate language, and so they have to kind of learn a little bit of each other's languages, and it mixes together. That's what a pidgin language is. So an example of this would be in Papua New Guinea when the British colonized it, this mixture between English and the native languages. Another example of this would be Spanglish. So a pidgin is just a simplified mixture of two languages for basic communication. Nobody speaks a pidgin as their native language. It's just for basic communication. A creole is what happens when that pidgin becomes so mixed together and so complex that people do start speaking it as their native language. So two or more separate languages that mix together to create basically a new language. That's what a creole is. An example of this would be the Afrikaans spoken in South Africa, which is a combination of Dutch with several other European and African languages all mixed together. Another really famous example of a Creole language is Haitian Creole. This is what the people of Haiti speak today. And Haitian Creole is a mixture of French and West African languages because the French brought African slaves to the island of Haiti and this mixture began. Originally it started out as a pidgin, but over the last 400 years it has become so evolved that it is now the language that people speak all of the time. So it's become a Creole. So that is the difference. Pidgin, basic communication between two people who speak two different languages. Creole is when that mixture becomes so entrenched, it's a new language. That's that mixture between the two. And then again, a lingua franca is when two people know a totally separate language, like English or some other language that they can speak to each other. So Swahili is an example of a lingua franca in East Africa, so the countries of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and so forth. In the 8th century, trade between Arab-speaking merchants and Bantu-speaking residents resulted in the development of Swahili. So Swahili is not only a lingua franca in this area, but it's also a Creole. It's a mixture between Arabic and African languages. And it is still spoken in this region today. It's the official language of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As we said at the very beginning, language is very, very important to culture, and language becomes intertwined with a group's cultural identity. For example, native Hawaiians whose economy relies on fishing have 6 words just for fishing nets because it's so important to them. Signage in some places reflect linguistic heritage, single language signs versus bilingual signs. For example, in Quebec, Canada, where they mainly speak French, all of the signs are in both French and English because while Quebec is mainly French, the rest of Canada is mainly English. But they have a law that says that the French sign actually has to be larger than the English sign because they don't want English to stamp out the French culture of Quebec. So another example outside of Quebec is the country of Belgium, which is in Western Europe. So here in Belgium, there's 2 different regions. We have the northern part of Belgium, which is mainly the Dutch language, and then in the southern part, we have the French. So the Walloons are the ones who speak Dutch, and the Flemings are the ones who speak Dutch, and the Walloons are the ones who speak French, and they are 2 different cultures. But we see here this little area that you see with the stripes where they are both Dutch and French, that is around the capital city of Brussels. So Brussels, everything there is bilingual in both Dutch and in French. Toponyms, which we learned in Unit 1, is the names of places, have a lot to do with culture. For example, the Greeks founded a colony and named it Byzantium, probably after a leader named Basis. After the city fell under Roman control, the Romans renamed it Constantinople after the Roman Empire Constantine. When the Turks seized the city in 1453, they renamed it Istanbul. So we see these names change depending on which culture is dominant over the various places. Another good example of this is several cities in India which changed names after India gained its independence. You had the colonial name of cities like Bombay, and then you have the renaming of those cities to reflect the Indian names of them, like Mumbai. An official language is one designated by law to be the language of the government. So typically this is going to be a homogeneous, made up largely of ethnically similar people. Iceland, Japan, Slovenia would be good examples. Some countries encourage assimilation, so they purposely have an official language to try to encourage people to learn that language. Several large ethnic groups wanting to honor all countries equally. So some countries have more than one official language for that reason. Zimbabwe has 16 official languages with English as their lingua franca. Canada has 2 official languages, French because of Quebec and English because of the rest of Canada. We said Belgium with the Dutch language and the French. Switzerland actually has 4 because of German, Italian, Romanian, and French all spoken in Switzerland. And India has like 27 different official languages because there are so many different languages that are spoken within India. English being one of the official languages because of the colonial history of English.